Hey everyone, it's Thorn, and in this video I want to talk about spellcasting. Specifically, next steps in spellcasting, or as somebody phrased it in a comment, taking spellcasting sort of to the next level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit you with a few kind of broad thoughts about casting spells and kind of how the way we think about that sometimes can shift over time, and steps that folks can reasonably take in order to kind of maybe expand their thinking about spellcasting. If you follow me on TikTok, where I've been posting pretty regularly lately, at Thorn the Witch is my username. I've posted a couple of videos recently about spellcasting explicitly, particularly about goal setting and how to determine whether or not the spells that you were casting are effective. So I'm going to touch on some of those same ideas here, but at greater length, plus with some additional things. So lots of folks get into witchcraft for the purpose of casting spells. I think that's why most of us get involved in witchcraft. It's very normal to be attracted to the idea of having magical powers, wanting to be able to make very tangible kinds of pragmatic changes in your life. In like the 90s and the 2000s, and this was probably true earlier, but I just remember this very consciously being like a teen witch. There was this weird kind of stigma about people who like openly admitted that they were interested in witchcraft because they wanted to do spells. And I always just thought it was kind of disingenuous and goofy. Like, because the idea is, oh, well, that person's just here for the spells, which means like somehow that person isn't serious, which just like, first of all, just objectively isn't true. And second, like, spellcasting is cool. Like, why isn't that a good enough reason for somebody to be attracted to something like witchcraft? Like, magic powers are rad. Like, who doesn't want those? So as I put my hand over the screen here to adjust it, thinking about that kind of generally, and like, okay, maybe you're a relatively new witch, you've been at it for a couple of years, you do spells out of books. How to kind of take things to the next level. There's a lot of videos on YouTube about how to write your own spells. And I'm not going to go into depth on that. I would say just go ahead and check out some of those videos. There are lots of books on that subject too. I think it's a worthwhile exercise, if you haven't tried that already, to really spend a lot of time like experimenting and writing your own things or modifying the things that you have in books. That's kind of like the obvious next step. So some additional things to think about. First, to me, one of the markers of somebody who's kind of taken things to the next level, somebody who's kind of like in the next steps sort of level of their magical practice, one of those big indicators is resourcefulness and flexibility. So being able to do things like substitute one thing for another. You realize that you need, I don't know, like rosemary for some spell according to a book, but you go, I know that I can use this other herb instead of rosemary, and I can substitute things and things will work well also. Having kind of a catalog in your head of alternatives is a good indicator of kind of where somebody is. That indicates that they've been exposed to other ideas, maybe other traditions, how other folks do things differently, and they have the kind of flexibility to think on their feet and kind of plug things in as they need to. So one way that's fun to kind of test and experiment with that. And I've done this as an exercise in coven situations, is to imagine that you are casting a spell for something, and you can choose, like, pick your thing, and limit yourself to whatever is in your magical space, or maybe your whole home, kind of whatever sort of parameter you want to apply to yourself. Maybe you can only use the things that are in your pantry or your fridge, your kitchen, whatever. Can you take what you have that's already around you and use those things to construct an effective spell? It can be a lot of fun. It can be a lot of fun to do as a group. If you're part of a coven or a study group, like, can you sit down and work together to come up with something according to particular limitations that you impose on yourself just for fun? And the test is that, as just kind of you're living your life as a witch, you are going to run into situations where you're just not going to have access to things for one reason or another. Maybe you're traveling, maybe something is expensive, maybe you live in a region where you can't get that plant that everybody on TikTok says that you need to do the thing, whatever. It's just a very pragmatic thing that you'll have to deal with at some point. So practice now, like practice when you do have access to things, and have fun with it. I think that sometimes the thing about spellcasting that gets in our way a lot of the time is I think we have hangups about fun, honestly. And I don't know if it's not to say that like magic isn't serious or like spellcasting isn't potentially a serious thing, but I think that sometimes we have hangups about enjoyment and pleasure and play in magical practice, particularly in witchcraft spaces. In some cases, I think it's holdover from previous religious experience, or sometimes I think that it's just kind of like baked into our kind of like capitalistic culture about how like, we should be working all the time and learning all the time, or just kind of laboring all the time. And if you're doing something for fun, it's because you're frivolous or, you're not serious or something. And I just really encourage folks to let that attitude go. There's a difference between play, especially play with a purpose. Just like with children, like play is how kids learn, but play is also how adults learn too. I just think that we stigmatize those things. There's a difference between playing to experiment and learn something and playing because you think something is stupid and you don't take it seriously. So I think introduce an element of play and have that manifest through your experimentations with magic. I think that sometimes we get hung up on this idea that every spell that we do has to be super serious. But one of the ways to grow and develop is to try things kind of just for the sake of trying them. It can be a good way to test your magical abilities, your magical effectiveness. Like if you're only doing spells when things are really dire and things are really high stakes, I think that sets a tone for your practice that sometimes can inhibit how effective you are in any moment. Like when you're practicing something, like if magic is a practice, witchcraft is a practice, spells are things that you practice and you get better at over time, then it makes sense to get as much practice as you can. So if you're only pulling out your spell crafting abilities, like when something is burning down, then I think you're necessarily not getting enough practice, perhaps. I've done silly things just kind of to even test new magical techniques. Because again, like the other cool thing about spellcasting is that it's a way to employ different sorts of magic. Like if you're interested in herbs or crystals, if you're interested in astrology, like if you're interested in kind of whatever the thing, there are ways to incorporate those things into spellcasting. But the way to do that is through experimentation, trial and error. So like find little ways to bring in those things to see what works for you. You can kind of test established traditions and folkways surrounding those things, modify them as you need to. That's how I learned about, just for example, using planetary hours in magic. I was never a really big astrology person. And in a lot of ways, like astrology is not a significant part of my practice. But I started using planetary hours just kind of as an experiment. I thought, hey, like this is a thing that folks do, and it's a thing that I see folks in like the ceremonial magic spaces that I'm hanging out in doing. Like, let's experiment with this. So I did a series of spells, kind of all focused on things related to my job and my pay, right? So they're kind of like vaguely falling in the category of like prosperity magic, but over very specific things. Like I was working towards a raise at work, I had applied for an additional position at work, like that sort of thing. So like stuff that mattered to me, but not stuff that was like life or death. And I would do workings according to different planetary hours, like after learning kind of how to do the planetary hour math. And over the course of time, I was able to keep track of which things worked, which things didn't work, which things kind of worked the way I expected them to, and which things worked in surprising ways. And over the course of several months, I had a lot of data about how to do that sort of magic for myself in the future. So just those are some more thoughts. And related to that, of course, that's another reason why record keeping can be so helpful. If you want to do it in the form of a grimoire or a book of shadows, just kind of, I think of it as like a magical lab book. Keeping those kinds of notes, what things worked, what didn't, what might you change in, the next time you try something. All of those things are just really tangible ways that you can go about kind of stepping your spellcasting up a level. So yeah, pushing your sense of resourcefulness, like what in your vicinity can you use instead of going out of the way to acquire things, especially like buying them at shops and that sort of thing. Like, is there a way to use what you already have? And then kind of maybe the step beyond that would be, what is kind of in my natural environment already? What do I have easy access to that I can use? That may mean learning about like foraging and wildcrafting. It could just mean learning about your town or city, like what products are made here, like what kind of raw materials do I have access to just by like stepping outside or going down to the local like flea market or farmer's market or whatever. Like that's another way to develop your practice as a witch. So building resourcefulness, developing that sense of play, being creative, keeping lots of notes. I think doing those things over time will necessarily develop your practice. I think we have kind of this unhelpful idea sometimes in witchcraft spaces that people are either good at magic or they aren't, or like some people are talented at casting spells and other people aren't. And my approach has always been much more pragmatic. Like I think for the most part, like anybody can learn anything if they have the right like structural support in place and they have the right resources and they have the right encouragement. So I encourage you to give yourselves that where you can. So just some thoughts. I'd welcome, of course, any of your tips and advice you'd give each other in the comments. And I will see you next time.